Book 5, Chapter 1. About a year after the adventure with Nellie, Ambrose Merrick at last caught that train from Lupton to Birmingham. He had waited for many years. He had yearned and sickened for the sight of the old land of his fathers. He had not allowed the memory of Gwent to fail. And now, when the whistle sounded and the train began to move out of the station, he was astonished to find himself so little uplifted by the granting of his desires. He looked up with a kind of sober joy at the railway bridge, on which the poor little boy had stood so often for so many hours, straining his eyes towards the west. He remembered that one day when the earth burned as with fire, and his heart and soul and body were faint almost to death. He remembered how he had been refreshed by the vision of the mountain, by the wind that breathed new life into him. It was curious, he thought, how against his own desire and his own faith he had ceased to take daily account of such a merciful marvel as this, which should have been a perpetual talisman, a constant defense against all weariness and sickness and despair, an hourly reminder that the world was not given up entirely to the powers of darkness. He understood the difficulty of the great act of faith, which must be renewed day by day, again and again, by a constant exercise of the will, or else the abyss, the fall into the black pit of nonsense and despair, which most people spoke of as the world, and not half a bad place either, if you take it the right way. It was so simple, the "not half a bad place" creed. One fell in with it so easily, without any conscious effort of acquiescence. One conformed even against one's own steadfast convictions, unless these were continually renewed and proclaimed. One knew better, perhaps. One had been vouchsafed sure proofs from within and from without. And yet it was so entirely natural to believe that man is sustained by loaves from the baker and meat from the butcher, and to take one's measures accordingly. As the train sped away to the west and the south, he resolved that this should be amended, that for the future he would daily remind himself that he was not fed by baker's bread and butcher's meat, but by miracles and wonders. But the past year had been given over to that process of dryness and fear which is called the purgative way. It is needful, but it lacks all refreshment and unction, speaking more of unworthiness and darkness than of light and compassions. He had come back to Lupton after that holiday with a certain mark of grimness about the mouth. He went down into the fire that it might cleanse him. He put away the thought of wonders and mysteries of which he was not worthy. As has been seen from some of his notes, he had already made himself acquainted with the species of voluntary stripping, the giving up of all the decorations and ornaments and vestures of the inner life. But the sense of his guilt and his offense now stripped him in spite of himself, and he became familiar with the dark clouds of desolation. He had professed the mysteries, and he feared lest they should be withdrawn from him forever. For the first time in his school days, he really and interiorly submitted himself to the disciplines of the place. Not that he thought it good or wise or suitable for anything but the production of boobyism, but he accepted it as an instrument of correction, and for a year he had endeavored to occupy himself as much as possible with the interests of Lupton, putting aside, as far as he could, his own life and his own hidden knowledge. But he felt, as the train rushed from Midlandia Maledicta to Midlandia Felix, that enough had been done in the path of penance. The book entitled Here Begin Terrors was closed for a season. It was time to open another volume. Here begin Great Wonders. He was nearly 19. In the autumn he would go up to Oxford for his scholarship examination, but he did not mean to go to the university, at all events for the present. He intended to submit himself to other schools and more remote ways of knowledge. He had made certain vows of reparation for the wrong he had done, and he began to have a glimmering vision of that which might prove to be the purpose and the end of his life. If this were to be so, if indeed he were called to so holy and mystical an office, to the celebration of such high and wonderful ceremonies, with what instant and especial care he must begin to prepare himself, how sternly he must shut out from his heart all the apparatus of vanity and lies. He feared lest he should have bowed down too low in the temple of the false deities, though the motive has been good, but he had tried to listen sympathetically to the doctor's sermons. And what a curse it had been during the last term! The main point enforced had been that one could not arrange one's life in separate compartments without relating the one to the other, that all life was of infinite and equal importance, that the games and work of school were to be regarded just as seriously as the pursuits and labors of later years. "Do not let us mistake," said the preacher one Sunday morning. "We are already inhabitants of eternity, here at Lupton in school and in the playing fields, in our sports and in our studies. Each action is of eternal import. Each action forms part of that character which will be our everlasting possession." And the whole gist of the series was that any boy who wished to be a plausible and successful humbug in afterlife had better set about his great task immediately. "Remember," said the doctor, "we are not in the Dark Ages now. None among us will ever be called upon to be the minister of a capricious and arbitrary sovereign. There is no one here whose gift of statesmanship will be exercised in concocting measures against the liberties of the people. There is no one whose military ability will be utilized in deeds of savage and remorseless oppression. We are not in the Dark Ages. There may be future prelates in your rank for all I know, but the prelate of today is successor in name only to the medieval hierophant. No, we are to serve a sovereign who wears no visible crown. Let us all remember once and for all that there is no more splendid service than that of the people, that if we win high place and high honors, these things are but held by us in trust for the benefit of our brothers and sisters, that work which is useless to the multitude is not work at all, or, at the best, is work which is not worth the doing. We talk of the Church as if the word were synonymous with the clergy. How foolish! How erroneous! The Church is merely the state in its ethical persona. It represents the state by morally energizing, endeavoring to touch the great heart of the people to higher issues and nobler aims. The Church, as the state, derives all its power, all its authority, from those whom it serves. Again I say, distrust, and distrust profoundly, all work, all service, that cannot abide the great popular test which I have indicated. Distrust yourself if you are not doing the people's work. Reconsider your position. Come down from the heights and take your place with the striving multitude below. Remember once and for all that popularity, in its true sense, is a noble aim. Nay, it is the noblest of all aims. What wonder that the Jewish populace cried Hosanna? He had compassion on the multitude. The common people heard him gladly. Let these words dwell in the minds of all of us, more especially in the minds who are soon to take their share of the great work of the world. Let us all beware. We are not to work for cliques, for small and select aristocratic bodies, however exquisite their taste, however high their standards. We are to work for and speak to the multitude, the common people. We are to win popularity. Ambrose shuddered and laughed at the recollection of this discourse and others like it. It was clear that he had had enough of such follies, and it was time for him to leave behind Lupton and all its ways. Already it seemed to belong to things departed. He would return for a little while at the end of the holidays and go through such formalities as were necessary, but Lupton was over. Its foolish routine, its magazines of cant, its dull pedantries, its sense of being at the center of all things. It was all past and performed, and lay in his mind like the recollection of a tedious and unimportant play, that one has witnessed and would willingly forget. Behind him all this weariness, its dolours and its languors, its pain and longings, behind him also the evil that he had done, which had so heavily and grievously weighed down his spirit. Before him was the land of desire, the end and the goal and the perfection. He was not 19, but already, it seemed, the call had come. He looked forward to his stay at the Warren as a time of refreshment and preparation for the work that he had to do. He was to revisit his old home. When his father had died, Mr. Horbury, who was the trustee, had bethought him of some distant cousins of the Merricks, people named Vaughan, whom, he thought, might be glad to take the old place during Ambrose's minority. Mr. Vaughan, a widower with one daughter, was delighted with the proposal. The rent was moderate, the air was good, and he had pleasant recollections of the Warren dating from a visit paid long before. It was an admirable arrangement for both sides. The rent was secure, and Mr. Horbury, who liked managing, and always managed well, felt that Ambrose was lucky to be in such good hands. Indeed, he was quite right. He invested Mr. Merrick's capital in some excellent securities, and when Ambrose came of age, he found himself not only the owner of the pleasant and beloved old house, but also the possessor of a very pretty balance at the bank, the accumulation of 10 or 11 years, after due deduction of his school fees, board, and general expenses. It has been hinted that there were defects in Mr. Horbury's character, but there was never better or more scrupulous man of affairs. Mr. Vaughan, the cousin, was an odd and retired character. One of the reasons which made him welcome the chance of taking the Warren was the fact of its remoteness from a railway station. He hated trains, and never wanted to take them, spending his time in a little shooting, a good deal of fishing, and the writing of an interminable romance, which had kept him quiet for 25 years. Nothing much was known of it, save that the author was always consulting Du Cange's lexicon of late Latinity. This did not seem very promising, and the ingenious author had neither the energy nor the guile of a brother of the craft, whose autumn paragraphs about the magnum opus in preparation appeared as regularly as the blackberries. Perhaps it would have been kinder if Mr. Vaughan had asked his cousin to spend the holidays at the Warren before, but the idea had not occurred to him. He supposed that Horbury was looking after the lad all right. At last, however, it had struck him that an invitation would be graceful, and perhaps at 19 Ambrose would no longer be a loud boy. Mr. Vaughan hated loud boys, and thought they spoilt life. He understood that they had to be fed on underdone mutton and rice puddings. They were always shouting. They never ceased from shouting from 5 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock at night, he persisted, and continually rushing about in staring white flannels. Nonsense, he would say. I know them. They do shout, and they never stop. I'd much rather live next to the kennels than next to a school. And what the devil do they mean by dressing in that absurd style? It's glaring. It's offensive. It's excessively silly. And why do they rush? What's the good of it? What do they get by it? I've noticed them. They can't walk like sensible people. They're always rushing, and it's most tiresome to look at. Moreover, they never, by any chance, know any single thing that can be of the faintest interest to any rational being. I have a black pig that could talk down a schoolboy any day. His name is Walter Mapp, and he is extremely intelligent. I value his companionship. He often goes out for walks with me. I would not take a loud boy out for a walk on any terms or conditions or considerations whatsoever. He would dress in white flannel, he would put a hideous stripy jacket on top, he would shout and rush all the way, he would high jump all the stiles, and a long jump all the brooks. He would stop now and then, and go through a most ridiculous pantomime with his walking stick, and roar out some rubbish about that being the way to meet bogglers bowling. He would not utter one word of the remotest approach to the distant boundaries of sense, if I walked him to the top of Bannai Brechaniog and back again. Damn the loud boy, and damn his masters for encouraging him to make such a fool of himself. Walter Map, now. Perhaps these sentiments had weighed largely in the forgetfulness of Mr. Vaughan towards his cousin. Even now he had tremors, especially after reading Mr. Horbury's last letter, in which Ambrose had been highly commended, not only for his brilliant scholarship, but more especially for his proficiency in games. "I have great hopes," wrote Mr. Horbury, "that he will make a big name for himself and do the old school credit. He will have a nice little income at his back when he comes of age, so he will be able to pick and choose his own career. So many of us have to take what we can get, and sometimes that means that our real abilities run to seed for lack of opportunity. Ambrose will be differently placed. He can afford to wait and look about him. He is a really fine scholar, and besides the ordinary schoolwork, I fancy that he has read a good deal on his own account. I don't see how he can miss his first, even if he tries. But what is more important than mere scholarship, he is good at all our games, and his fast bowling will, I expect, do even more than his Greek verse to place him, first at the university, and then in the world. It may seem illogical enough, but as a matter of fact, athletics will carry a man farther than any amount of scholarship, and it is in this account that I feel so confident of Ambrose's future." The letter had filled Mr. Vaughan's mind with the most dismal apprehensions. He sincerely regretted the invitation. He meditated a diplomatic indisposition, but concluded that it would be better to suffer the young man for a time. If necessary, he could have all his meals sent into the study on the plea of writing a book. He would not, on any pretext, allow Ambrose to practice bowling on the lawn. That was settled, and Sylvia might hint that her father found shouting disturbed him when he was writing. But Mr. Vaughan looked pensive after sending that letter, and he was quite uneasy at breakfast on the day of Ambrose's expected arrival. Ambrose had written that he was not quite certain of his train. He would walk from the station, so there was no necessity to send anyone to meet him. He would carry a handbag, and his luggage could be fetched the next day. He wished to re-enter his native land alone, as lovers desire but each other when they are reunited after long years of absence. By the time that the train reached Hereford, Lupton had vanished from his mind and all recollections of it. He had been exiled, and he was returning, and when the great hills rose up before him, a strange emotion beat within his breast. He did not know the precise boundary of the counties, but at the sign of the hills he took off his hat, worshipping the dear soil of Gwent. The land had an unutterable word for him, and all his being made answer. The earth kept that day a quiet festival. He could almost have said, Montes exulteraverunt ut ariets, et colles sicut agni ovium. It was a day of soft sunshine behind a delicate veil. The land was all in a golden, wonderful radiance, and the clear streams glittered in the light, and the leaves of the trees danced with exultation in a wind blowing from the west. He looked out of the carriage window with a gaze of such ardor and delight as lovers know. Qui convertit petram in stagna aquarum, et rupem in fontes aquarum. His sojourn in the dry and stony land was ended. There rushed the translucent brook down from the mountainside, from the very heart of the rock. He fancied that he could hear the sound of the pouring waters and their voice of gladness. There was the glen which led to the wild country, the land of green bubbling wells, and the far purple fields of heather, and the world of the golden scented gorse, where the great rocks looked like magic druid rings. He and his father had climbed by that little path so many years ago to see a church of very old religion, and the well of an old saint. The brook rushed on. The line ran parallel with it for some miles. He feasted his eyes on that wonderful clear stream. He had seen no such sight since the day on which he had left Gwent, for about Lupton most of the rivers and brooks were poisonous sewers, and even the unpolluted waters were dull and muddy and sluggish, as they crawled through dull fields. Here was quick crystal, which sang laetare as it passed from the hill into the valley. Its pools were a shining darkness. Its ripples were of silver light. It was pure as the dawn upon the mountains. It was as if the great alchemy of God had transmuted the hard innermost rocks with all their secrets into that rejoicing brightness, signifying how before the day of ruin all the world was a plastic light, an ever-changing mirror. On his left hand was now the hill of the apparition of St. Michael the Archangel, a strange riven height venerated by the people before the coming of the Black Hag of Geneva, who sends body and soul quick to hell. Here, they said, in the old days, those who knew would sometimes go apart, climbing the red height till they came to the chapel of the Archangel, a very small and ancient place, of which the foundations still remained, standing in a thick wood of ash trees. This observance, it has been said, furnishes the explanation of the curious poem by Morvran, called The Sovereignty of the Ash. Ambrose, as he gazed up towards the mountain, could see the wood, the boughs of the ash trees tossing in the wind, and he remembered the poem, a strange piece of metrical ingenuity in the original, which had served as a model to many generations of bards, though none had ever equalled it in the complexity of its structure. In its lines, Morvran had mingled alliteration and rhyme and assonance in a wonderful manner, and as the poets said, besides all this, there were inspiration and unction of such a singular magic that it was sometimes spoken of as the supreme incantation of Morvran. The poem represents all the trees as contending for the honor of sovereignty. As the first hues of the dawn above the forest of Cor-arbennic, there appeared a red blossom out of the shadow of the trees. The rose spoke. It was like the clear chant of the angels. Though I am least of the trees of the wood, though I am hidden and overshadowed in the wood, though I dwell often in obscurity, yet I claim principality in this assemblage, because I alone am a native of the old garden, because I typify the accomplishment of the saints, because in my blossom is hidden the great mystery, because I waft abroad sweet odors of paradise, ancient relics of the lost kingdom. The hazel boasts that its boughs are the choir of the birds of God, the wych elm of its use in magic. The oak has borne sway from all ages. The whitethorn is the shining house of Merlin. The yew has an honorable station near the altars of the saints. And so the poem ranges through all the trees of the wood till the ash triumphs. Because I keep watch over the shrine of the chief angel, because beneath my boughs shone the majesty of heaven, because I was a veil to the glorious appearance, because I was visited by heaven's principal warrior, Machen is my advocate, the bearer of the offering, unto the supreme altar of the Most High. Ambrose was murmuring these last lines to himself as the train passed the base of the Mount of Apparition, and the men who had got in at Hereford glanced round nervously and looked at the cord of communication. But Ambrose looked longingly at the boughs of the ash, tossing in the wind on the far mountainside, thinking of the stories told of those who retired to this shrine in the dark ages. Before what was called the flaming picture of the chief angel, these vowed persons would remain 3 whole days and nights in silent devotion, wrapped, so the legend said, far out of the earthly regions and raised to the heavenly places, to the state of paradise, so that when they came down again to the valleys and lower places of the world, they were as those who had voyaged in the blessed isles, since their garments were scented with celestial odors, and about them was the visible shining of light. The train rushed on through the rich and happy meadows, by the wild thickets, by the shimmering fields of corn, by the old white farms. Before his eyes now rose that well-remembered and venerable Mynyddt Mawr. High upon it he could see the line of straggling beeches and the walls of Craddock's house, gleaming in the sunlight. His heart thrilled at the thought of that which rested there, concealed in a dark place, of the holy cup in its glistening veils of samite. It was as yesterday that he bent low before those ghostly splendors, and saw the images of immortal things that showed in the crystal mirror of the blessed work. The golden wood resounding with the magic summons of the bells, the far-lifted sanctuary of Cor-arbennic high above the ninth wave, the vision of the saints of Britain sailing on the fairy sea to Avalon. He could scarce see the great dome of the mountain above him, scarce rejoice in the deep woods below, scarce fix his eyes on the white walls by the beaches for the recollection of these clearer marvels that had appeared before him. He felt as though a voice cried to him from that place. The cup seemed to summon him to kneel once more and to behold new visions. Craddock's house passed out of sight, and there rose the great wall of Mynyddt Main, and far down to the south, Twym Barlum, the lofty height that looks far over land and sea, where the wind is like strong wine. He sank back in the seat and wondered how he could have borne that long and dreary exile. Facti sumus sicut consolati, veniens autumn venient cum exultatione, portantos manipulos suos. He had wondered still more deeply by what compassions he had been preserved in that house of folly which he had inhabited, which he had entered, helpless and defenseless, a little lonely child. How was it that he had not been ruined utterly, that he had not become a practical man, longing for a time when he should be able to do some great work in the world, say, by sitting in the House of Commons? There were lads of his own age who were already bubbling over with enthusiasm in the cause of humanity, who were already beginning to count the rewards that really earnest, disinterested work for one's fellow man seldom fails to procure. They pointed to young Hasley, an old Luptonian who had changed sides twice and was certain to be in the next cabinet of his party, though he was barely 30. Many of the boys, taking the doctor's solemn warnings to heart, had already made friends who would be useful in later life, useful, that is, in forwarding them in their desire to do some good in the world. Ah, how had he escaped from this cesspool, from the discipline and teaching of the masters and the companionship of the boys, without losing his soul forever? Through his father's teaching and the mercy of the compassionate, he said to himself. But what a marvel it was! He had been 9 years at Lupton, and still, and with ever greater awe and adoration, he remembered and venerated the mysteries of the cup of Tylosant. Chapter 2. It was about the middle of the afternoon when he left the local train at Caermaen station and strolled idly through the deserted town, where there had once reigned such splendors and such mysteries. Grass was growing between the cobblestones at the side of the empty, desolate streets. An old man, bent double with rheumatism, was slowly crawling along with the aid of a stick, and seemed the only inhabitant. Ambrose turned aside and walked by the grass-grown way that led to the Roman amphitheatre, and he sat on the old stone stile, looking across the circle of grassy mounds towards the steep wooded hill beyond. There was no breeze now in this enclosed valley, and no leaf stirred. The trees on the hillside were as though they were painted, and a shimmer of heat rose from the grass. He could see the white limestone road winding on the other side of the river. That, too, was empty and forsaken. Caermaen was the city of a bygone day. Its life was but a mouldering memory. The very names over the little shops were strange to him. The bow-windowed grocery, a famous place in its generation, was shuttered up, and he had seen a placard on a wall announcing that at some meeting about something or other, Captain Tillier Smith, J.P., would be in the chair. Who was Captain Tillier Smith? He had never heard of him. It was curious. He knew well enough that his father's old friends at Cor-arbennic had died or left the place many years before, and that a new generation of strangers reigned in their stead. Yet he felt a certain sorrow in the thought that these old ties had been broken, a certain disappointment that, to the welcome of the hills and woods, human tones had not added their friendly voices. The sight of those empty, grass-grown streets, of wide-open places devoid of life, of houses where once his father and he had been welcomed, now in strange hands, of the unknown name on the doctor's door, all these signs had uttered loneliness, and had filled him with mourning for the past. He was to visit strangers, relations, it is true, but he had never seen them, and Cor-arbennic had suddenly reminded him how utterly alone he was in the great world. Some of the boys were decent fellows enough, but they were a part of the chapter called Lupton. If he could think of that chapter without resentment and sickness, it was very well, but it was idle to dream that any of its passages could have any real share in his heart. He was alone, and for the moment he was sad at the thought. He could not help regathering all the memories and fancies that were associated with the place in his mind. He left his station on the stile and wandered about the empty streets, thinking of pleasant evenings spent long ago in this house or in that, of warm welcome and warm comfort, and kind voices and good dead people. There was a little house in a back street where an old lady, an ancient friend of his family, had once lived. Her teas he remembered with a great affection. She always had a particular cake of which he was very fond, and used to produce afterwards from the cupboard some ingenious and novel game which would amuse him for the rest of the evening. A stone cross marked her place in the churchyard. She had died a year after his father's death. He remembered the pictures that had hung in certain rooms that once had been familiar. What had become of the oil painting of the Highlander that used to be over the sideboard at the Garth? And where were the green cut-glass vases that had decorated the mantelpiece in the doctor's drawing-room? The vases were smashed, perhaps, but many of the objects that he remembered must be still in being, scattered about the earth in strange surroundings. Where was the pagoda in carved ivory that had stood in a corner of a room at the castle? Where was the serpent which the old vicar had always used as a text for his recollections of church gallery orchestras? Was that picture of some incident in the American War of 1812 still the subject of discussion in some strange household? The Trevors had made it into a kind of after-dinner pastime. One was asked if one knew who the American officer dying in his cabin under the Stars and Stripes could be, and conversation at once became easy, if slightly imbecile. He liked to think that all these varying objects had somehow escaped the common lot, that they delighted no strange eyes, lay derelict and despised in no distant seaside lodgings, mouldered in no shop. Rather, in the land of the unknown, there was a house of memory in which they were all gathered together, and here the wraiths of the old Cor-arbennic folk met together under the united signs of the serpent and pagoda, the Highlander and the sea captain. There they discussed to a happy eternity the old fireside stories, found the clue to knotty genealogical problems that had puzzled all their days of mortal life, settled at last the question of how Matilda Kirby came to be one of the Williamses of Pontoneuth, and issued in a final and authentic form the true history of Evan Owen, the Red House's marriage to Joan Morris, Penyrall. And after the wedding they went to live at Wiveliscombe. That's all I know. That used to be the conclusion. But in the House of Memory all doubts would be resolved, and the identity of that United States officer would be clearly established. There had never been much uncertainty as to the Highlander. He was Vish Imvor, a character in an old romance, once a great favorite. Ah, happy friendly folk! It was certain that there were good suppers in the house of their habitation, and afterwards there was something hot and comfortable. He wandered at last over the bridge, and strolled along the old Usk road, till from a gate he had a clear view of Cor-arbennic standing above the river, the old white inn with mullioned 16th-century windows nearest to the yellow water and the wet shining banks, and above, in tiers, the houses rising all bright in the sunlight. Away from the river, the north of the town was bordered by stately Lombardy poplars. Indeed, there were many green leaves within the circuit of the walls, orchards of apples and pears and quince trees, and here and there the more sombre ilex made spaces of refreshment between the huddled roofs. And all about the town the level meadows were spread broad and green, dotted here and there with ancient thorns, and as he leaned over the gate, it was the turn of the tide, and the salt savour came up from the Severn Sea. Far to the north the valley followed the winding river. Deep Wentwood, the old forest, rose high to the east. To the west there was a maze of rolling hills, bounded by the vast mountain. He was gazing on the white walls, luminous in the sunlight, when the silence of the valley was broken by a man's voice singing as he came along the lane from the north. The words, as far as any words could be distinguished, sounded foreign, and Ambrose looked round with some curiosity. The man came towards him with a swinging stride, and when he saw Ambrose by the gate, he stopped his odd song, the tune of which sounded as outlandish as the words. He looked like a sailor. His skin was burned to the hue of copper by fierce suns, and he carried a bundle on a stick over his shoulder. Ambrose wished him good day as he was going by, and the man hesitated a moment, and then said, "Could you manage the price of a pint? I've tramped 30 miles already, and I fancy I've got a good many more before I get to Cardiff." Ambrose gave him a shilling, and asked whether he was looking for a ship. "I'm much obliged to you, sir," he said. "Yes, I want a ship. Something easy. To Bordeaux and back would suit me, though I wouldn't mind Trieste." He called it Tri-East. "You've been abroad a lot." "I have. I've been inland too, as well as on board ship. The Levant, India, Persia, all sorts of places, at all sorts of jobs. Yes, I've travelled a lot." "Have you seen any Indian juggling?" "Lord, yes, plenty. It's all fake, if you ask me. They're clever, you know, sir, but people tell a lot of lies about them when all's said. There's that rope trick they talk of. I never seen it, and I never see anybody who did. A man must be drunk to believe nonsense like that, so it seems to me, though some of them can tell fortunes most wonderful." "You mean they come true?" "Yes, I'm certain of it. An Arab fellow that I'd got out of a nasty mess when I was about the Levant taught me a way of his own, so he said, and I never found it fail." "I wish you'd try to tell mine," said Ambrose, who was amused by this encounter. "Here's another bob." The sailor-man was well enough pleased. He had the potentiality of many pints in his pocket, and the thought, as he said in his own fashion, lightened the burden of the 15 or 16 miles to Cardiff, or certain pints might be foregone and the balance expended on lodging for travellers. In any case, his position was secure. He set down his crimson bundle under the hedge, and taking the stick, prepared deliberately for magic. Ambrose sat on the gate and fixed his eyes on the proceedings, though he felt sure that it would all end in a fair woman who had a fortune. Still, the method might be novel. The wanderer glanced to the road, and found, as it happened, a considerable stretch of smooth sand, which the last rainstorm had washed into a bay of the bank. On this, with the end of his stick, he very deliberately and carefully drew certain letters of the alphabet, all in capitals. He set them down in an order of his own: A, B, G, D, H, V, and so forth, ending with T. There were 22 in all, and some of them he shaped oddly, because, as he explained, they were not the common letters that the children learned at school. This done, he rolled his eyes impressively, to the huge delight of Ambrose, who felt that he was almost getting his money's worth. And then he asked the number of letters in his client's name, Of this information he made a memorandum on the edge of the sand, and then with the tip of his stick he began to punch the sand with aimless rows of little dents. It was a long and complicated process. There was much counting and reckoning at the end of it. Some of the punch marks were smoothed out, and others, in odd figures and patterns, took their places. He looked up at last with a disquieted air. "Beg your pardon, sir, but you're English, aren't you?" "Yes, of course," said Ambrose. "Why?" "Well, you see you're fixed to the T." He pointed to the letter. "I can't make it out." "Why? What does that mean?" The man shuffled uneasily. "Shut up in prison, or something of that kind, I believe." He lied with difficulty and confusion, and took up his bundle again. "It's nonsense, of course, sir, you being an English gentleman. But there, you don't want to believe in such things. As I said, I expect it's all fake. I must be getting on now, sir, and thank you, I'm sure." He hurried off towards Caermaen, turning back once at the corner, and looking at Ambrose with startled eyes for a moment, and then he was gone, and Ambrose laughed to himself. Evidently some horrid fate which the sailor dared not utter was prophesied for him, and he wondered what it could be. And then, while he looked at the letter T on the sand, the words of the Frenchman at the cafe came into his mind, and he remembered what the old Irish fiddler had said years before. He jumped off the gate and began to run after the sailor, but though he ran through the village as far as the bridge, the man was not to be seen, and an old woman sitting at her door told him that no such person had passed by. Indeed, the wanderer had anticipated Ambrose's course, and watched the pursuit through a hole in the hedge behind which he lay secure. He did not wish to be forced into explanations, and he cursed the Kabbalah of Ben Mueling, who, as it happened, was not an Arab at all, but a Levantine Jew. It was late in the afternoon, and Ambrose strolled once more through Caermaen. It was time to think of the Werne, and he went along the road, beside the river meadows, till he came to a stile that he knew of old. He wondered whether he could remember the way. It led, he knew, by the verges of deep woods, by wild hills and lonely valleys. One passed the ruinous chapel in the middle of the gorse-grown field, and the sore brook was crossed by a narrow, trembling bridge. The path was but an uncertain thread, for few used it, and the bridge was so masked by the rich growth of dark, glossy alders that it was easy to miss the right point. "The divinations of sailor and fiddler, the prophecy of the Frenchman," said Ambrose, "passed from me when once I entered again those enchanted hills, those woods of most dear recollection. Even before I had turned from the road, a procession of happy children met me. They had been flower-gathering, for the local flower show, perhaps, and they came towards me as if they had been participants in some old festival. In front there were two girls who bore great spires of valerian. I remember that it grew on the rocky bank a little further down the road, where in its shadows flowered also the golden St. John's wort. The children with the valerian flowers wore such a look of joy. The hair of one was black, of the other golden, that I forgot the strange significance which the flower thus carried used to bear in Gwent. I suppose, indeed, that the old symbolism of Canos Corve has now become extinct. Behind these two came their companions, boys and girls, bearing their red and yellow, blue and white, but most of all, great bunches of creamy meadow-sweet that scented all the air. Some, with a pretty face, had made spare flowers into twisted garlands, which they wore on their bare heads, and they had evidently been by marshy as well as flowery soil, for a few had woven rushes into fantastic shapes, and bore baskets which reminded me of the mystic ferns carried by another older procession, and one ingenious lad had made of these materials a fearsome-looking monster, a species of dragon, which he waved in the air. Last of all came two boys carrying great reeds and flags gathered by the river-bank, and as a flower dropped here and there, they left a faint track of blossoms behind them. And just as they passed, one of them must have produced his penny-whistle, for I heard the faint notes of an old tune piped as I turned aside from the road and began to climb the green hill towards the wood. And before the boy's uncertain music was lost in the distance, a bird sang to me, darkling from the shadow of the trees, and after the bird, the ripple of the brook rose up through the still valley, and after the sound of the clear water, there was the whisper of the evening breeze among the leaves of the hedge. It seemed as if all the way enchantments beckoned to me. I found that I remembered the path quite well, but again and again I was tempted to go astray, to explore unknown valleys, to climb round and solitary hills, to penetrate into the green light that shone from the recesses of the woods that as a boy I had never visited. I wondered what I might not find if I entered that little vale that opened towards the west, half screened by a hazel thicket, and what country should I see if I stood on that hilltop amongst the waving bracken. I regained that afternoon all the sense that I had had in the same land when I was a little boy, the sense of a dweller in a mystic territory, whose every path may lead to fairyland, where magic dwelt in the brooks, in the flowers, in the green woodland, and on the bare, turfy height. Only a little was known. A few feet beyond the path might lie the entrance to the enchanted region. That white thorn bush on the hillside might be the resort of the 3 fairy birds of Rhiannon. Those broken stones might hide the entrance to a cavern filled with Celtic treasure, with the gold ornaments of old kings and heroes, with the last books of Merlin's wisdom, and the figures of his spells. But I persevered on my way, and the sun was still above Minith Main when I stood again before the door of the Wairn, and said my salve. Chapter 3. Ambrose Merrick always asserted that he had written 12 books concerning his visit to the Wairn. These books, he said, formed a great prose romance, intermingled with certain songs, mysteries, episodes, and parables. He has been heard to declare that he must shortly set about the revision of the manuscript and prepare this magnum opus for the press. He even quoted titles of some of the books on occasions. There were the Silvia in Silva, the Mysterium Calicis, the Hypnerotomachia, the Nuptia Mysticae, the Mons Magorum, the Nox Illuminans, the Cantus Planos, and 1 or 2 others that have vanished from all record. It is, however, very doubtful whether the great romance ever existed in so tangible a form as manuscript. It is, with more probability, conjectured to have been the reflection of a glowing dream that was always shining vaguely in Ambrose's mind, which he hoped, perhaps, to reduce to a corporeal shape at some indefinite opportunity. He felt, it is believed, that the theme must be treated more than worthily, with a rare and curious eloquence, and he wished for a time when he should feel within him fit force and inspiration for the carrying out of this great design. As it is, in place of complete books, there are only notes and fragments, and of these all possible advantage must be taken. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it is hard to say which, these jottings and memoranda are expressed in such a manner that the meaning is often excursively obscure, as was evident when they were mischievously submitted to the judgment of a well-known authority in literary questions, the famous author of "Get on, and be quick about it." This gentleman wrote that there was capital stuff in the manuscript. All that it wants, he said, is a little arrangement and a liberal use of the blue pencil. With some telling illustrations, I think it would do well as a Christmas book for young children. Why not, indeed? Gulliver's Travels, by the genial, kindly Dean of St. Patrick's, is to be found on every well-regulated nursery bookshelf, and Ambrose's notes do certainly suggest the atmosphere of a fairy tale. So far as this famous visit can be regarded from the common outlook, it seems to have been a very pleasant one. The old house was just the same as he recollected it. No alterations had been made without or within. The 2 sides of an unfinished quadrangle in grave grey stone still fronted to west and south, looking across the broad terraced lawn, the sunken lane and the marshy land, across the winding brook and the wooded hills, glancing on one side towards Wentwood, the wilderness of leaves, and on the other to the great wall of Minith Main. The stone mullions and transoms were still there in the windows. No attempt had been made to reform the diamond quarries into plate-glass panes. It was old tinged glass, full of whorls and flaws and inequalities, and it shed a dim, soft light on the old furniture and the old pictures, both dating for the most part to the middle of the 18th century. As chance visitors had said, if one wanted to live in an old curiosity shop, one had better do so at once. Those sensible people would prefer real chairs and tables, and windows that one could see through. These people were still mid-Victorians in those days. Now their houses are furnished throughout in bad imitations of 18th century furniture, known to the owners under the comprehensive name of Chippendale. It does not matter. There are many other subjects left for them to talk balderdash about. Books, pictures, music, religion. Imbecility, ignorance, impudence will never lack their due pasture. And for some good but obscure reason, the imbeciles and scoundrels always seem to get off scot-free. Wilson and Lockhart, for example, are still respected names. Yes, it was all the same. There was a little book with a curious binding in stamped gold still on a side table, just as he remembered it. And while he admired this reverence, his cousin, Mr. Vaughan, came in, cordial but evidently nervous. He was a short, thick old man with a square white beard, at which he tugged in moments of excitement, and there was a slight stammer in his voice as he made Ambrose welcome to his old home. "You will want to come permanently, I suppose, before long," he said. "We shall be sorry to leave. I admired your father. I have tried to keep everything as it was in his day." "You have been wonderfully good," said Ambrose. He pointed to the book. "I remember that book, just in that place when I was a little boy." It was evident that Ambrose was not a loud boy. His voice was low, and he did not shout all the evening. Sylvia Vaughan, a dark girl, appeared just before dinner, and afterwards they sat out on the lawn. Mr. Vaughan was pleased to find that Ambrose smoked. He always said that it was one of the greatest proofs of the insensate folly of all schoolmasters that they prohibited tobacco, since a mild sedative was evidently the very thing that the average schoolboy wanted. "Wild hearts must be hocused for the safety of the public," he said. "Schoolboys are wild hearts. Therefore they should be hocused. Conclusum est in barbara." He was ready to prove his minor premise by innumerable instances. One would have thought that he had specialized in schoolboys all his days. In reality, all these remarks were generalizations from a noisy young nephew who had stayed with the Vaughans many years before. But Ambrose was quiet and talked sense. He had some information about the existence of the pointed arch in Ireland, in churches that were certainly of the 11th century, and possibly of the 10th. Mr. Vaughan was most interested. He said that he could not quite agree with the conclusion of Ambrose's father that the existence of these arches showed that Gothic architecture, properly so called, was of Celtic origin. Still, the point was highly important. And then they talked about rhyme. Was it brought into Europe from the East or not? Ambrose ventured to think that it was an independent growth. He quoted the Easter sequence, Victimae Paschali, as an instance of rhyme in a very rudimentary state. Then back to Celtum. What was the deduction to be drawn from those curious references to the introduction of the chalice in the Percival and in the Lower Brack? How far were certain features of the Celtic church and of Celtic ornament to be set down to Egyptian influence? The night was so calm and windless that when a servant brought out a 2-branched silver candlestick and set it on the little table beside them, the flame rose clear and unflickering. "God send us the light of heaven," said Mr. Vaughan when the candles were brought, and Ambrose remembered that the use of this ejaculation was a custom that George Herbert's country parson liked very well. The faint glow shone about Sylvia's face. It was as if a hidden glory flowed from her as she sat smiling, well pleased that her father had found at last someone to talk to. On the one side was her dark beauty, her hair drawn down from her forehead over her ears in a style that was then, though, uncouth, unfashionable, and hideous. And on the other was the shadowy valley of the Soar, whence the fragrance of the meadow-sweet ascended with the fragrance of the wood, whence at intervals rose the lonely piping of some bird. Soft from afar came the whirring note of the farm-owl. He was deep in the bracken on that high vague hill towards the south, and without ceasing they heard the murmur of the brook. Mr. Vaughan was quite overjoyed. His few neighbors thought him a very queer old man who was always reading old books, a vice from which they were singularly free. He, on his side, thought them noodles and boobies, and perhaps there was a good deal to be said for both opinions. But he often longed for someone with whom he could talk about the many outlandish subjects which interested him, and Ambrose was more than satisfactory. But how long could he go on like this? Would he not begin to expatiate presently on his achievements at the games? Horbury had laid stress on Ambrose's athletic abilities. He would certainly show how to meet Bogler's bowling. Probably the fit would take him quite suddenly, and he would begin to shout and rush about. Or perhaps he would illustrate his theory of drop-kicking, with the little table serving instead of the ball. But Ambrose went on smoking quite placidly. He was speaking with some enthusiasm of the beauty of Old French, and maintaining that the modern language, in spite of its swift and exquisite charm, had lost a great deal by having no equivalent to the English Bible. In fact, he said, at times I almost feel as if there were something to be said for the English Reformation. Not much, of course. Suppose that in every deceased leper a surgeon could dissect out a beautiful jewel. There would be something to be said for leprosy. Mr. Vaughan grinned with delight. "Lupton must be a wonderful school," he said. "You went in a lot for games, Horbury tells me." He wanted to know the worst. His cousin looked gravely at him. He could not conceive that such a sensible old man would take the slightest interest in the school games, so he answered indirectly. "As I was coming along in the train today, I passed a field with a lot of goats in it. A good many of them were quite young. I assure you, sir, I never saw anything quite so fantastic or quite so jolly as the sport these kids were having, leaping yards into the air to clear a small stream about a foot wide, stopping dead in the middle of a run because there was an oyster shell or a bit of glass in the way, butting at each other with such solemnity, such an evident appreciation of the rules, that it made me roar with laughter." "Yes," said old Mr. Vaughan. "What then?" "Well, I've seen a half-dozen dirty little boys having a splendid time with the lamp-post and 2 jackets as wickets, and 2 sticks and a big bundle of paper as bat and ball in the back streets of Lupton." "Quite so." Mr. Vaughan's pipe gurgled with enjoyment. "Proceed." "And farm labourers in a good old-fashioned skittle-alley with lots of good beer. They enjoy themselves too, but if you were to paint the kids with coloured stripes, or made rules about the weight of the paper ball, or insisted on all farm labourers up to the age of 80 playing skittles twice a day, then I think the whole thing would become a beastly nuisance. How the farm labourers especially would hate it, if the parson brought in allusions to the dry alley regularly every Sunday, and drew lessons from the man who always takes the heaviest cheese, and the man who can never finish his beer on time, and mixed up the skittles with the kings of Israel and Judah. And fancy the small boys being harried to the lamp-post and thrashed severely if they didn't play up. Of course, the goats wouldn't stand it for a moment, even if they were instructed in the valuable formative influence on the goat character of high-jumping and butting." Old Mr. Vaughan roared. He made much more noise than the loud schoolboy of his dreams. "Come in," he said. "I have some really old whiskey. Kiss him good night, Sylvia," he added as they stood in the hall. "We are going to sit up talking till any hour you please." Ambrose blushed scarlet as the beautiful Sylvia bent forward and kissed his cheek as a matter of course. It was clear that he had discovered the earthly paradise. He bent low and took her hand and kissed her fingertips, and she smiled at him with kind eyes. The old man and he went to the study, where the servant had set the whiskey ready. All the old books were in their place, but Mr. Vaughan had utilized a vacant space to set up a large bookcase with his own special volumes. It was an extraordinary collection, the famous Ducange, the works of Duns Scotus, and several other of the schoolmen, collections of rhymed Latinity, some books on medieval costume, a great array of Graal romances, monastic records, one tall gradual, splendidly illuminated on parchment leaves, Histoire des Filles de Joie au Moyen Âge, and a manual of the tarot. These were a few of the oddities that caught Ambrose's eye as he glanced about him before sitting down. "It is like a great wood," he said, as they poured out their drink, pointing to his cousin's bookcase. "Everything is to be found in it, from the oak to the scarlet fungus, and one hears the bubbling of the wells, the dripping of cold springs, the sound of the wind, and the rustling of little furry beasts in the undergrowth." "Yes, it is an amusing collection, isn't it? I find them all useful for the romance I am writing." Ambrose tried to hear more about this romance, but his cousin would say nothing. It was not till some days had passed that Mr. Vaughan trusted his cousin with the secret of the romance. He was writing it in a kind of faked low Latin, and though his scheme was not much more foolish than that one which William Morris wrote his romances in Old English of his own invention, yet Ambrose had much ado to contain himself. Indeed, the idea rather appealed to him. There was a fantastic unreasonableness about it that was after his own heart. And yet it was so funny that he went for a walk directly after he heard this great matter. He walked briskly, puckering his cheeks all the way, and when at last he was a mile or so from the Warren, he lay down and rolled in the grass, roaring and shrieking and bellowing with laughter till he was quite faint. Old Mr. Vaughan had shown him a leaf of his manuscript, and he had seen a chapter title, Haga de Giardino, which meant the garden hedge. It was, somehow, more than he could bear. Yet, if he listened to the old man, his scheme seemed absolutely logical. It was quite impossible to resist the cogency of his arguments. "You see," he said, "in the first place, I, personally, regard the English language as a quite impossible medium of expression, for the present, that is. Of course there must come an end to the present corruption. Liberal and conservative politicians, Anglican bishops, dissenting preachers, wealthy manufacturers, and journalists will not be suffered to rule the land forever. When the politicians and manufacturers are hanged, when the bishops and the preachers are burnt, by the way, I should make the fire slower for the bishops, then, perhaps, English may become fit once more for the use of a man of letters. The journalists, I forgot, they will have to eat their own words, of course, the worst torture of all. But now, do you know that a man who doesn't split his infinitives, or use like for as, is regarded as a very affected person, a kind of euphemist? They say literature is meant for the people, and the people have no time for hair-splitting over words and sentences. This is a democratic age, you know, and the people, I suppose, must have darned hot stuff, or 40 million Englishmen will know the reason why. Exaggerating? Nothing of the kind. You can't have read the papers, or you wouldn't talk such nonsense. Exaggerating? Look what this ass says, this gigantic, gargantuan, super-imbecile jolthead. Look, I have cut him out. I should like to cut him up. Do you see that he says that Keats and Ruskin were so full of their subject that they had no time to consider themselves as literary craftsmen? Who is going to write English when slugs like that have crawled all over the language? Why, it's like finding a toad, a blindworm, 3 snails, and a dozen, woodlice in a meat pie, and then finishing it. Here he goes again, the unfailing instinct of the great public. Authors should make it their aim to preach to this great public. He pretends to think this lunatic, let what he calls the great public have some voice and authority in literature, about as much of either as the passengers on a liner have over the navigation of the ship. No, it's quite out of the question for a self-respecting man to have anything to do with such a literary world as this. Therefore, my only course is to write my romance in Low Latin, a fine tongue, a most flexible medium, a synthesis of the ancient world and the modern, possessing the sonority and splendor of the Old Latin, mingled with the life and movement of the new languages. It has never had journalism written in it, and it never will. Ambrose ventured to put a cautious question as to the public to which Mr. Vaughan hoped to appeal, and his cousin pointed out that he would speak to the learned over the whole world, since he would be using a language which was understood by everyone with the slightest pretensions to education. I shall be read by Frenchmen, Germans, Mexicans, Russians, Swedes, and citizens of Guatemala. I shall appeal to an expert audience from which the populace are entirely excluded. I shall restore the art of letters to its proper dignity as a great craft, a mystery. Oh, there are innumerable advantages in my plan. For example, I saw in a review the other day that it was a pity Mr. Thingamy, who wrote so well, should produce a book which could not possibly be put into the hands of a young girl. I shall escape all that. No one would ever dream of placing a Low Latin romance in the hands of a young girl, or of an old one either. He began to talk of the beauties of his medium, of the strange music which it gave so readily. It is like an old violin, he said. It is permeated with melody. It sounds and echoes with the enchanted song of the age when it came into being. It chants of crenellated walls, of great cathedral glories. It has the savours of Gascon wine, drunk in painted taverns. It smells of incense. It has seen the rich wonders of old cities. It knows the dimness of the cloister, the trumpets and the clamour of the tournament, the rapture of the hidden saints, the revelry of flowery festivals. And mark, it has never been tainted by the defilement of popularity, and it has never been the means by which the mob has uttered its foolishness and its wickedness. All that is of good in the people it has assimilated, and yet it has always worn the garments of the Latin life. It is a peasant, if you please, but a peasant who has received the sacerdotum, and is entitled to wear the vestments of the church. Nobody has ever been interviewed in Low Latin, and in it leading articles never will be written. And speaking of music, you see this song I have just written in the Phrygian mode. Look at these neumes. You observe the peculiar shape of the podactus and the biverga. I shall insist on an exact reproduction. It is most important. And Ambrose went out and hid himself in remote places, giving way to inextinguishable mirth. It might be all very true. It might be, as his cousin said, that the chosen medium was the exact equivalent in language to the Gothic in architecture, the marriage of the Latin genius to the Teutonic and Celtic. Yet it was all a farce in 5 acts, an elaborate and staged absurdity. There were many pleasant days and nights at the Warren. He went for long walks with his cousin Sylvia, revisiting many revered places of ancient pilgrimage. He looked up authorities for the old man, and one day delighted him by solemnly burning, in the face of the pig Walter Map, his cricket bat and flannels. The days passed in ceaseless sunshine. All the nights were laden with the odour of the dewy fields and the running brook, of the procession of leaves and flowers. Chapter 4. In the notebook marked The Warren, there is a kind of preface which relates, presumably, to that great romance which has been mentioned, to the tale which Ambrose was always hoping to tell some day. I feel sure, it begins, that all art should be profoundly ethical if it is to deserve the capital A, if it is to be art at all. I am told that this point has been insisted on lately, and I am very glad of it. one hopes that these sermons will have some result, that people who are worthy of better things will cease to produce the horrible manufactured article which has grown so common of late, which, so far from having any ethical relation, is patently the result of a desire to please a great number of tenth-rate intelligences, and to make a big income. I suppose it is hardly necessary to say that work produced under such conditions, and with such beggarly aims, can have no conceivable relation with any system of morals known to man. I suppose that a fetish priest in an African swamp would reject an offering made in such a spirit as unclean and detestable, as very bad medicine. Let us by all means and in all ways insist on the high morality which is demanded of all art and of every artist. It is delightful and surprising to hear that this is being done. It is one of the best signs of the times that I have heard of. I am glad that the tide has turned, that literature and painting are once more to take their true position, which, after all, is a higher one than that of the thimble-rigger and company promoter. If we once have the writer of books and the painter of pictures recognizing that their work is done under the highest ethical sanctions for the highest ethical ends, we shall soon hail an instaurutia magna in the arts. Of course, I take it for granted that the ethics in question are thoroughly human ethics, that they relate to the life of that most exalted miracle that is called man in the most exalted region of which he is capable. I feel satisfied of this, because writers who are taking up the high standpoint of which I have been told, who are ready, doubtless, to face the jeers and sneers of readers whose conception of morals is chiefly derived from the lessons given in the dissenting Sunday school, writers such as these, I say, are, of course, aware of the mystic wonder with which man has been crowned. They know that he is permitted to look into mysteries which are hidden from the holy angels. Man, it may be said, is called upon to sing a perpetual mass, to offer a continual sacrifice. There is a beautiful passage in Pater's Marius. It is a description of the Eucharist of the early Christians. Marius saw the offerings of the faithful, the bread and wine and oil, and was struck with the exquisite symbolism by which the dull, dead matter was, as it were, borne up to heaven, transmuted with a quickening word, consecrated to the service of a great mystery. But, in truth, this high and especial service apart, such offering should be of daily, nay, hourly, obligation. It would be a great work to investigate and enumerate all the wonderful privileges and offices of man. Perhaps there are many which have been forgotten, a few even yet to be discovered. But surely this mystical and universal priesthood must be among the highest of his prerogatives. It is his right and duty to offer not only the bread and wine of the Eucharist, but all the universe. Day by day, at sunrise and evening, in the darkness of the night, he is bound to say, Jube haec preferi per manus sancti angeli tui in sublimi altare tuum, in conspectu divina majestatis tuae. Every day he should secretly utter the prayer, and do thou, uncovering the veils of enigmas which mystically surround this holy rite, make them gloriously manifest to us, and fill our spiritual eyes with ineffable light, and having cleansed our poverty from every pollution of the flesh, make it worthy of this fearful and dread hierarchy. What are Hayek? What is this holy rite? Why, these things are the whole world, from the clod to the stars, all sounds and sights and colors, all heights and depths, all rivers and seas, rain and snow and frost and wind, the voice of the thunder and the breeze in the brake. And not only these, but all sensation and emotion, all thought and all desire, all joy and grief, the raptures and the longings of the soul, the venoms and black poisons of life also. For in this rite there is a transmuting word, which can change these latter into golden and most precious elixirs. This is the perpetual mass of all humanity, which, as I say, we are all bounden to offer according to the measure of our gifts. We are to bring the whole universe to the supernal altar, praying that the veils of enigmas may be uncovered, that the transmutation may be effected, that the great work may be accomplished, that the Graal may be revealed. Let us consider a moment. What is Lincoln Cathedral but a heap of stones dug out of the earth and offered, and transfigured into mystery and splendor? There are stones of the same sort in a stink factory, in a Protestant meeting house, in an ugly modern street, in a railway station. Again, here is an extract from a dissenting tract called Jesus and Company Limited. Chairman, the Almighty Himself. Manager, the Lord Jesus. Secretary, the Holy Spirit and Comforter. Head offices, Beulah Land. Branch offices, Thornhill Church. But this horror, this foulness, is made out of words, and words are the material used in Round thee blow, self-pleached deep, bramble roses, faint and pale, and long purples of the dale, let them rave. These in every shower creep, through the green that folds thy grave, let them rave. One man sees the earth and devotes it to industrialism. Another man, who sees the same earth, fills the Turner Room at the National Gallery. What a hierarchy then is this, which, from matter in itself nothing, capable indeed of serving the worst and basest ends, can effect the great miracle of beauty, raising the dead stones into a shrine of glory, making the common words into a wonderful poem. Indeed, gloria et honora coronasti eum, giving him the power of this great magistry. I take it for granted, then, that when ethics are insisted on as the basis and the end of all art, the word is to be taken in its very highest sense, that the ethics in question are to be supremely human ethics, concerned with man in his highest exaltation. I take this for granted because I cannot for a moment conceive that any writer out of an idiot asylum would insist on art being in the popular and vulgar sense moral, that is, the conveyance through an unsuitable medium of a copybook maxim. The colored supplements are often moral in this sense, and in the fiction of the Reverend E.P. Roe it is difficult to find a page without its lesson, duly pointed. One need not say that such art as this is not art at all, and is in the highest sense profoundly and bestially immoral and degraded. The Venus of Milo is one of the greatest moralities that man ever conceived and executed. The little colored statuette of the child feeding the kitten out of a saucer is a filthy outrage on artistic ethics. So when I hear that the ethical basis of art is being fervently advocated, I am delighted, because I am certain that the word cannot be used in a wrong sense. Ethical art cannot possibly be meant to refer to imbecilities which are infinitely below the artistic standard of the most degraded savages. I am glad, too, because, once this high view of art is accepted, we shall hear no more of that hideous nonsense about books or pictures being of no practical use, of no practical interest. One does not know exactly what meaning the anthropoids who write this attach to the word practical, but one is forced to suppose that they are repeating in another form the dicta of an able animal named Macaulay, who said that the Platonic philosophy was of no use because it had not led to any inventions which increased the comforts or conveniences of life. Pour être vraiment grand il faut être l'aventure du nouveau cabinet hygiénique et laxatif. I have no doubt the philosophy of the learned pig is a very good one, for the learned pig. I am sure that the amiable and in his own way sagacious animal would sternly denounce as impractical anyone who hung his sty with old masters and recited to him the works of Homer while he dined. But I object to his probable opinions being adopted as the final standards of literary and artistic criticism. But if I ever write the romance I dream of so often, if I ever finish the Sylvia, I shall be prepared for the old sentence. It will be censured as unpractical, because it teaches no useful arts. It will not tell of the cheapest method of converting gangrened pork into sausages, nor will it facilitate the poisoning off of our superfluous children by means of tuberculosis milk. Certainly not a book for sturdy, practical men, for the descendants of the stout old Roundheads. Need I say that Master will have none of it? Master will pronounce it to be profoundly immoral, as he licks his greasy chops over the fat bacon and the full-flavored report of the West End scandal in the Daily Something. Master is a strong believer in the liberty of the press, but as a moral man, he cannot and will not tolerate impure and licentious literature. It is probable that if Ambrose had set himself to writing his book, instead of writing about it, the Sylvia would have been brought to a happy ending. As it is, there are but odd notes and fragments, mere rough sketches for the tale that was never to be written. The following excerpt is chosen for its intimate bearing on Ambrose Merrick's inner life. It is written partly in the third person, partly in the first. Here it is reduced for the sake of uniformity to the third, and a good deal of editing has been found necessary, many of the sentences being incomplete. It was written, presumably, in a sudden burst of energy, and the words are scrawled across the page in a hasty, untidy hand. He lived, then, the happy life. In that enclosed valley, under the shelter of the hill, by the singing brook, he felt as though, after all those intolerable years in the house of torment and folly and lies, he had entered into the great dream, which is the golden hope or the high memory of all who know. It is called a dream, not because it is unreal, but because in that state, as in a happy and well-directed dream, desire and fulfillment are one. Silver moons can be summoned down to earth to bathe in haunted wells. Rose gardens blossom amidst the snows, and singing choirs are not wanting, nor wine nor fairy feasts. The world, as it were, is melted in the crucible of a wonderful alchemy. It is dissolved in the throes of a mighty transmutation, and the hard and stubborn rock is once more that plastic mirror in which all things are seen and all visions are realized. The doctors of the mysteries have many names for this state, and have indicated its existence under various and strange figures, and they have described the method of its attainment by symbolisms which are, perhaps, designedly confused and confusing. Though of all the veils of concealment that have been hung before the portal of this palace, none is thicker nor more impenetrable than that which is woven with strange and fantastic images of deceit, and is called occultism. For those who pay more than a moment's attention to this veil, which should be brushed harshly aside, are captured by its curious follies, and, while they trace its pentacles and sigils, suppose that they have attained the object of their desires. It is doubtless well that this is so, since those who would gaze on such things have uncleansed eyes that are not fit to behold beauty. The true guides, as has been said, describe what they know by many and varying signs, and the books in which these matters are contained lie open for all men to read and understand, if they will and if they can. Thus the secret is most safe, though there is no pledge of secrecy, and indeed very often no hint that the mysteries are being painted before our eyes. The secret is safe, because these writings have always two senses, the inner and the outer, and the uninitiated never fail to choose the outer meaning, which, indeed, has its own beauty of the lower order, and would think anyone who declared that there was an inner meaning to be mad. They may even be told of this secret significance, and to them it is as if one pretended to find words in the wind. It is declared that there are many ways of approach to the gate of the great dream. Some, it is supposed, have found the way through a great sorrow, others through a great joy, and again there are the paths of renunciation and conformity. It may also be that year by year a drop of water falls into the cup till at last, all suddenly, it bubbles over, and the thirsty are refreshed by these runnings which they never looked for, since a drop of water is but a little thing. But in the day of overflowing, they say vidi aquam, etc. It is not denied that there are truly many greater things than this state, since indeed it is not the end of the journey, but rather a place of refreshment by the way. As the shadow of a great rock in a dry and thirsty land, it is a refuge from the burning and feverish heats, from the hailstorms and the fire showers, from the deadly cold of ice and snow. Ibi fons vivus, fons immortalis, aqua non amara, ibi vera floret rosa rosarum in horto incluso. And though it be not the city which is the end of the journey, no man can deny its great wonders, nor is he at first ready to believe that they can be surpassed. Ambrose had heard hints of this place long before. He had thought, indeed, though he was in great error, that he had attained it, when he quoted the saying of the anointed bard, "With the bodily lips I received the drink of mortal vineyards, with spiritual understanding wine from the garths of the undying. May the great angel intercede for me, that these be mingled in one cup." But that which he enjoyed was but a natural ecstasy, which was permitted him because he sinned in ignorance, and not from malice, nor against the light. Now, however, he was astonished beyond all imagination to find both within and without matters that he had never so much as dreamed of, which indeed he would never have believed unless he had had this experience. He was less foolish than before, or rather, knowing the evil he had done, he was slow to credit the compassions that were passed upon him. He was humble, with great cause for the deepest humility, and knew himself to be more worthy of the fire than of the unction. Yet he was forced to say, though his lips trembled with unworthiness, "Impignasti in oleo caput meum," for truly sense consorted with spirit, and that which was below was as that which was above. Hortus odoribus affluet omnibus hic paradisus, plenac cantitia, plenac grati, gaudia risus. He would gladly say more as to these miracles, but he is forbidden to utter another word, and fears lest he has said too much and has spoken too plainly already. For the secret way is a way of paradox, and those who seek it because it is secret, or for the joys that they believe it will afford, will most assuredly either find nothing, or that which is worse than nothing. It is hard to say and hard to understand, but there is a sense in which it may be said that those who seek shall not find. So let them first consider what matter it is that they seek. Ambrose then lived at the Wern in such happiness that even if it were permitted him, he could never say enough. And for one thing he was ever after unceasingly grateful. If there could be a sun which set, and yet left its radiance and afterglow to shine through all the night, illuminating the darkness, to this his condition could be compared. For though he went out from the house of rest and refreshment, the knowledge he had gained there never left him. And when afterwards he met persons who affirmed that thirst was a delusion of the senses, and that there was no such thing as water in the world, how could he be at all moved by them? He had been thirsty, and he had found a well, fons vuvus, aqua regeneros. And consequently all the finest and most cogent arguments against the existence of water were to him but a curious excess of foolishness, and indeed very singular, as if on a battlefield wounded wretches, parched and burning with horrible desire, should shriek out continuously that it was impossible to suppose for a moment that such a thing as water ever had been or could be. Now he was indeed laden and overladen with benefits. For besides that which has been hinted at, he received the great marvel and miracle of love. It was not many days before Sylvia and he saw in each other's eyes the completion of earthly desires. Sylvia's father, busied with his books and papers, sent them out together in the fields and woods, and often all the day they were together, searching out old paths and new, wandering far over the hills, pressing up the steep sides of the mountain, alone on the endless waste of the summit, severed, it seemed, from all the turmoil of the world on that wild high plain, set with grim limestone rocks, where the unceasing wind sang as it were with the strings of a great harp. Or there were lower heights, all aflower with thickets of golden gorse, and here in some sheltered cove of the unshorn bushes they would rest in the sunlight, hearing the clear wind and the clearer lark above them, in that fine and delicate air scented with the multitude of the yellow blossoms. They loved to find these hidden places, to which sometimes narrow paths, worn by the sheep, led with many and intricate windings, like the turnings and returnings of a labyrinth, and once within the heart of the maze, they would sit at ease, alone with one another, speaking of many things, while the white clouds floated across the sky and the high wind sang. There were other days devoted to the wilder region of the north, beyond the territory of the mountain of the apparition, where the little town rests in the hollow between great hills, between sharp peaks on the one side and a huge dome on the other, where the Gavany flows into the Usk. Beyond this town there is a way up a steep hillside, through a wood of dwarf oak trees, and presently one is aware that one has entered into the world of the mountains, for they stand about on every side, and reach far and far, beyond and beyond, into the deep heart of Wales. Here, then, it is as if one looked upon a sea of wine, for the great purple billows, heather-covered, roll on and follow one another like Atlantic waves. There are green islands of giant bracken there, many fountains of cold water, many swift streams rushing over glittering boulders. There the singing of falling water never ceases in the land of the slopes and valleys below the wine-dark billows of heather. Again, Sylvia led him to the country called the Moors, a strange level plain of marshland and water-dyke and sea-blown fantastic trees that stretches all along the banks of the yellow Severn, where it washes the land of Gwent. They wandered up the grassy alleys of Wentwood. It was a day of the Vale, as the old poets of Gwent called such weather. The high Lord Almighty, ruler of heaven's fair mansion, where blessed guests feast for ever, drinking wine of the undying, fashioned the mystery of the world out of precious elements. Gold was assigned to the sun, dominating all regions. Golden are dawn and sunset. Golden is the last reward of the soul. The moon is of silver the multitude of the stars, and white clouds and glittering waters and the mists that arise from them. But I have seen the day of the Vale, in which both elements are mingled, when the great luminary is suspended in a silver lantern. I have seen also a shining piece of the spirit. They set out very early in the morning, by hushed lanes, by woods dripping with the odors of the summer night, by paths through gleaming dewy fields, by the meadow-sweet way, where a tiny brook made a winding, flowing procession across the grass. All the world was tinged with silvery light. Not a cloud appeared in the sky, only a shining canopy. As the Vale grew thin, a clear glittering light would sparkle in the fields and in the woods, as if green trees and green grass underwent a white purification. A filtered ray would illuminate for a moment a bough in the luminous shadow, and a sudden gleam would touch the river, and blossom on the bare hillside far beyond. They were fishing for salmon as Sylvia and Ambrose crossed the grey ancient bridge, and he told her the story of Elphin, the son of Gwythno Garanhir, when he was exiled from the delights of Britain. In an evil land was Elphin exiled, where there was no green thing, nor any pleasant shadow under the tree of the wood, nor the flowing of bright streams, nor the bubbling of wells. Rocks and grey deserts and burning sands, abounding in scorpions, were all about him, and his heart was sad, because he was ignorant of the way of return, nor could he discover the track that led to the Isle of Britain. But he came at last to the shore, where the grey sea rolled into the land, and as he stood there, desolate, the fish swam in the billows, and the birds flew over the billows, and the wind blew chill on the rocks, and the sky was overclouded, and the rain came hissing down, cold and bitter as death. And as he stood there, shuddering, he heard the salmon in the sea crying to one another, "Why should we stay here? Let us away to Pembro. These waters are inclement. Let us swim to Gwlad Morgan. What delight in the grey water! Let us be gone to the refuge of Gwent." And every salmon leapt in the billows, but one great fish proclaimed, "It is necessary that we await the coracle of the blessed company." Then saw Elphine, a glowing and a shining on the deep. Then saw Elphine, the holy vessel filled with the perfumed glorious company of the saints. Like a strong swan, it beat aside the waves. Speeding like an arrow, it rushed over the billows, blown by the wind of heaven. And a light as of a burning rose flamed on its masthead. Ambrose told no more. He said he had forgotten the rest. They rested for a while on the grey bridge. He was thinking of old dreams, and fancied that he heard above the course of the waters the echo of the saint's bell, thrilling and ringing from beyond the verge of the world. They entered all the wild green region of the wood, which is filled with enchantments. To the south, the city of the legions, and the issue of the Usk into the billows of the sea. To the north, the river streamed like dim silver between unshaken reeds and still blossoms, past the entrances of leafy dells and hollows, under the shadows of many silent woods. As they ascended, the mountain appeared between the breaks in the leaves, and through the veil a white gleam shone on Myneth Mawr, and Ambrose thought it lit on that house where the cup of Tylo was preserved. And sure was he then that the golden voice of the vessel came to him on the air, with certain words that he might never utter nor make known to mortal. He asked Sylvia whether she heard any sound, but she had heard nothing except the pouring of the water of the wayside fountains. They deserted the road and sought the inmost recesses of the wood, by paths of smooth, soft turf, by beechen alleys. The day before there had been a great heat, and the sun had sunk like a palpitating rose into the mountain, and the sky had deepened to a dark and glorious violet, clear and glowing. So now on every blade of grass the dew lay misty, shimmering in the light of the veil, as if the earth were spread with fine green samite. Now they came to the highest ridge of the wood, and trod the green causeway that had once been the way of the eagles. On the one side they saw the rolling hills bounded by the mountain wall. On the other they looked down into the deeps and the heights and all the green billows of Wentwood, as it sank into the level. There was a hollow beneath them where the ground was marshy, and there the mist of the night still lay thick, like a white lake, with green leafy shores all around it. They sat on a fallen tree and gazed on the wonder of Wentwood, across the level, across the yellow sea. Ambrose sighed as though his heart were healed. He drew a deep breath of the sweetness of the wood. He remembered little else of that day's adventure. They made their way to the last of the moors, by many winding tracks, by forest deep, by wild bare land, by leafy lane, and by that strange old village that stands in the place of a golden city, bowered in orchards, sunny on the slope, between the wood and the sea. And in the evening, as they returned, suddenly the veil vanished. They saw the deep rose gardens of the sunset, all the world transmuted in the crucible of red light, so that every leaf was but a petal of the great rose, and a crimson river flowed down to the ruddy waters of Carmine. Unawares, they took each other's hands as this miracle was performed, and like children they walked together as the grey night descended. Ambrose finished the story of Elphine as they drew near to the Werne. He said that he was taken up into the ship of the holy ones, that then he saw all the marvels of the world, for they came to the fairy isle, beyond the glassy floods, and at last returned with a divine treasure to the havens of Britain, where all men knew that Elphine had been in the state of paradise, for his garments were perfumed and odorous, as with many spices of Arabia. Chapter 5. It is odd enough that when Ambrose's notebook was submitted, as has been stated, in no very respectful spirit to the judgment of an eminent literary authority, the little episode of Elphine and the magic ship, as he called it, was one of the points most emphasized in the great man's very courteous letter. This story in particular, he advises, should be written up for all it is worth. Is the legend really an old one? Would it be possible to get up a discussion as to its sources? Anyhow, it should be expanded, and I know a man who could do some capital colored plates to illustrate it. This emphasis is odd, because, as it happens, Ambrose returns to the tale himself, and illustrates it in his own fashion, which is a different one from that proposed by the authority. He does not continue the love story, if there is a love story, of Sylvia and himself. A line is drawn across the page of manuscript, and the following dissertation takes the place of the colored plates. Many explanations have been given of this curious mythos of Elphine and the coracle of the blessed. It is not necessary to do more than mention Professor Evans's very ingenious and original conjecture that Elphine was a solar deity, that the saints are really dawn goddesses, and that the treasure is evidently the sun, returning in splendor after the rigors of winter, or perhaps after the darkness of night. A later scientific authority has demonstrated with immense learning that Elphine is most certainly a culture god. The treasure may be some sacred object or fetish deemed essential to the success of the crops, but is more probably the seed itself, symbolizing vitality and the constancy of the reproductive forces of nature. This demonstration also may be mentioned and passed by, since folly is wearisome, even though it be learned. In the old Welsh manuscript at the Wern, which my father had catalogued, from the color of its very ancient binding, as the Red Book of Llancarfon, neither the sun nor the crops are assigned these important functions in the genesis of the myth. Instead of these matters, there is a curious dialogue poem in which St. Cadoc, surnamed the Wise, is supposed to answer the question of a disciple. There are in all 150 verses, but those which relate to the coracle and the divine treasure are as follows. Venerable Cadoc, illustrious in the company of the saints, inform me, I entreat you, concerning the ship of the blessed. Whence did it sail? From what far regions? Excellent disciple, you ask of a great matter. Be instructed, then, concerning the holy vessel. It sailed from a far region, from the exceeding brightness. It sailed from the great deeps, from the bottomless abysses, where the light of this world is as midnight darkness. It proceeded from the region which is named God. Its flight was swift as the lightning, the billows boiled beneath it. Its radiance was terrible as gold on the brow of an emperor. Its saints sang Alleluia, a song that is triumphant. Its form no man could discern. Its hues were ever-changing. All the colors of the world were shining on that vessel. If the jewels of the mass chalice were living, to these its hues were comparable. This was the ship that conveyed the great treasure, the principal divine mystery, a relic of paradise. By a single leaf the nature of the tree may be judged. If the casket be difficult to describe, how much more the jewel? The names of the treasure are infinite in number. It is reflected in the eye. It is hidden in the flower. All men seek for it in all regions of the world. Many have gone astray, descending to the depths of hell. Hence it is that the instructed call this treasure heaven. Rightly indeed, Ambrose proceeds, is the treasure of the coracle given this high and final title. I need not say, of course, that the verses from the Red Book of Llancarvan have been interpreted in various senses by the few who have seen them. My father had the manuscript transcribed and 25 copies of the book printed. Some of these he sent to his correspondents, but I believe that on the whole he was disappointed with the letters he received. The most enthusiastic comment came from a German scholar, the successor of Zeus, who was deeply interested, but purely in the philological forms of the text. Of the home authorities, one interprets the treasure as the ovium character, or, in a wide sense, the art of literature. Another says that, in his opinion, the discovery of the use of metals is hinted at. And a third writes, it is clearly one of the many missionary legends which occupy so large a place in Celtic literature generally. It has great affinities with the Graal legend, which was, no doubt, originally a picturesque account of the Christianization of Britain. And so forth and so forth. But how wonderful these verses are, not in their expression, which seems to me very much below the standard of the best Welsh poetry, but in their apprehension of a profound mystery. Of course, in comparing them with the mythos in its prose form, which is more generally known, it must be remembered that the Isle of Britain in Celtum has much the same significance and symbolism as Israel bears in Jewry. The material island has been transmuted and glorified, unconsciously perhaps in some cases, till it and its mountains and rivers, its hills and havens and cities, are as sacred and as mystic in their sense as Sim and Sean and Jordan are in another terminology. So the statement in one of the Cadwallader poems that Saxons shall be eradicated and bards shall flourish could be equated by the Philistines shall perish and the sons of Judah shall rejoice. This general consideration is necessary to the understanding of the particular legend, or rather myth, of Elfine, the coracle and the treasure. It is rightly indeed called heaven, for it is heaven manifested, a relic of paradise, a flower from the old garden. How truly astonishing it is to meditate on this great mystery, or rather on this sovereign and especial revelation and manifestation of the mysteries. The real truth is so infinitely greater than the truth as it is imagined to exist by the followers of the supreme vanity called occult science. These people, as I have noted elsewhere, are in reality caught in the folds of the thick veil of multitudinous illusions. But I am thinking now of their conception of what the truth is. They think of it as one may think, and rightly, of the higher mathematics, Chinese, or astronomy, as an abstruse and difficult study, success in which is to be attained by much intellectual effort, by the acquisition of many formulae, the receipt of much careful and expert instruction. To this vast error they add another. They believe that the lore they desire has been kept secret by certain bodies in certain hidden sanctuaries, in the same fashion by similar machinery and methods as were used by the great craft guilds of the Middle Ages to preserve their trade secrets. Not in such wise is the treasure of the coracle to be attained. How marvelous, to those who understand, is the thought of this great gift, not enclosed in the custody of any secret body, but lying open to the whole world, one may almost say, touched and tasted, seen and handled by every man, the theme of constant conversation, of books, of pictures. No country or region is devoid of its presence. It is the subject of songs both good and bad. It has been built in stone and marble. It haunts the closes of music, and yet so great is the mystery, not 1 in 1,000, even of those who have treated it worthily, have the remotest thought of what it truly is. It is everywhere known and everywhere unknown, by everyone praised, by everyone despised. Those who would robe it in most splendid garments strip it naked, Those who believe that they are the most devout of all worshippers scream hideous blasphemies. These things are of the nature of paradox, but the wisdom is a paradox in the earthly language, and its gifts are received incongruously, if one may say so. It may well be that a man has learnt the mystery of the stars by speaking a single word, if Dante knew anything of this matter. So great is the mystery, yet we can imagine that a black pygmy or some such savage might think of a cathedral as solid when he first saw it. He might perhaps think its height very wonderful, its pinnacles and spires strange fantastic rocks. The windows would appear masses of glittering crystals, disposed in curious tracings and patterns. The organ and the choir might well be deemed an odd effect made by the wind blowing through such an intricate forest of jagged stones. The gargoyles and statues would pass very well for freaks of nature. There are just such queer things in sticks and stones and vegetables in every museum. But he would have no notion of the existence of the inside of the cathedral, the pillars and the arches, the glory of the painted glass, the depths of the crypt, the splendors of the vaulting, the veil of the rood, the laver of regeneration, the burning torches, the fuming incense, the singing priests, the altar and the sacrifice. How can he so much as dream of these things, gazing, as he thinks, on an odd stone mountain? All the whole world gazes at the cathedral. Few, indeed, have any notion that it is a cathedral, that it has a within as well as a without, and that it is the shrine of a great mystery. It is set on the mountain of the world, and cannot be hid. By how few can it be discerned? Nay, some even have entered, and have found nothing but mumbo-jumbo magic being done in the sanctuary, their eyes being dim and bleary. What would a thirsty costermonger on a bank holiday make of a magnum of Lafitte, the juice of a great year? He would know that it was wet. His thirst would be satisfied after a sort, but he would spit, very likely, and pull a wry face, and call for a pot of the foulest ale, to take the taste away. How many myriads of children have looked at and handled, and trodden and gathered and flung away, how many myriads of daisies, since there have been children and daisies on the earth. How many of these children have understood the nature and being of a daisy, according to the laws of botanical science? So great is the mystery. Everywhere is the treasure present. Everywhere it is visible. Scarcely at all is it known. And for its high elect servants it holds most intolerable, unconjectured mysteries and sacraments, and so they who know most know also how poor and slight their comprehension is. They who serve the flame, and they alone, understand how unsearchable are its inmost depths. Here Ambrose's disquisition ends, and after several blank pages in the book, there is a strange matter concerning a valley at night. It would seem that the old man being busy with his odd tasks, the two cousins had wandered forth, had crossed the marshy land, and entered a hidden valley on a warm, still night, when the roses of the sunset seemed to linger in the western sky, and the air was so hushed that not a leaf stirred on the poplar or on the aspen tree. They sat in the valley by a little rippling stream, breathing the solemn air of the approaching night, made aromatic by the growth of sweet-scented ferns, by the subtle odor of the meadow-sweet, and very slowly the darkness gathered about the boughs of the twisted oak, about the fairy drooping of the ash, about the feathery spray of the birch. The olive-colored willow leaves became gray as they dripped down to the little torrent that poured beneath them. The glimmer vanished from the beech, and the old yew in the middle of the brake darkened into a black mound, funereal, melancholy. But the thorn-tree of the narrow crooked stem and the spreading growth of leaves stood out clear against the skyline, on the summit of the wall of turf that shut in that hidden valley. The air was growing dimmer, but the faintest rosy light now hung like a veil above the dark ridge of the mountain. But on this night the light never faded, for now the great full moon swam upward from the thin drifts of cloud and glowed over the hill. At first there was a great circle of dull red, glorious but without radiance, and as it mounted higher it shone with a rich splendor, mingling with the last afterglow and enchanting the earth utterly. Before their eyes the world was changed, and all the forms of things were imbued with a new and magical significance. This was now no valley in Gwent, no petty glen among the hills and woods that lay near the Werne. Into some strange country it had been instantly transmuted in the of God. Nay, it was not wholly new, for in dreams they had visited it, and in desires and in ineffable longings that could not be uttered, in waking visions some glamorous shadow of it had transiently appeared. There were depths and heights, dark shadows and isles of light, that each of them had seen with half-closed eyes when they were children, and that great tree that spread out its boughs like a fan on the summit of the hill had its double in old memories. A little while ago, but a few moments since, there had been a break before them. Now there was the image of a gigantic ancient wood, a grave of mysteries and of hauntings whose boughs gave oracles, in whose black depths lurked all the awe and terror of the unknown. Vidis ut faunos lateat in silva, ibi saltat et cantat chorus nympharum aeternus. In dreams, too, they had been astonished by the high walls of earth that surged steep about them, by the wizard trees that were of no common growth, by the wild light that poured in a flood upon the valley, by the hushed silence broken by the faint ripple of the tiny stream. Ambrose began in a low voice to utter the great invocation, and as he spoke, something of horror passed away and peace returned to the valley. It is believed that in this place they told each other all their thoughts and all their love, and made their vows either to other unto life's end. Ambrose spoke of the anguish of the penance that was upon him, that for his sin he must forbear that which he had used so ill, that for them there only remained, if she was willing, the marriage of the cup. And notwithstanding his aversion from the methods of occultism, it is probable, for various reasons, that he has used on this point a certain reticence and reserve, considering apparently that not everything is to be spoken. Hence it is not easy to say what exactly is intimated by the phrase the marriage of the cup. It is natural, of course, to suppose that some reference is intended to the famous cup of Tylosant, which his father had shown him when he was a little boy, and as a matter of fact, there are some notes of a pilgrimage made by Sylvia and himself to Craddock's farm, where they undoubtedly saw the holy vessel. It seems to have been on this occasion that Craddock, now a very old man, told Ambrose of the destiny of the chalice on the failure of the line of hereditary keepers, and the charge was given and accepted, which led to Ambrose's happy and glorious end, and passing out of this life into the pleasures of paradise. Furthermore, it is certain that with the approval of Mr. Vaughan, Sylvia and Ambrose spent a week at Hentis, Craddock's farm, and that after a rigorous fast and the recitation of a solemn and ancient ritual, they watched before the cup for a day and a night. Greater than all my recollection and all my dreams, writes Ambrose, were the glories and splendors of this marvelous and holy work. Again I saw with clearer eyes, with more piercing vision, the endless wanderings and turnings of the spirit in the maze of its journey. Again it seemed impossible that such a majesty could be the work of mortal hands. For a second time my soul was wrapped into the ways of light. I entered that ringing wood of gold and silver and bronze, and heard the perpetual entertainment of the 3 fairy birds of Rhiannon. I saw the seashore of the savage rocks by the realm of the wastelands, and the foam was driven in torrents on the rocks by a great roaring wind. And then again I saw the white light burst from the walls of the awful sanctuary of Cor-arbennic, where all the hallows and treasures of the island of Britain are preserved. I know not how long my spirit dwelt there in the glorious place of the perpetual choir, while there were communicated the words that cannot be uttered, the mystery of mysteries, from age unto ages. One body, one spirit, beholds the secret glory. Here, it will be observed, there is no reference to his companion, unless, perhaps, the last sentence may contain some esoteric meaning, which it is not possible to specify further. There is something to be said for this view. One may note, by the way, the grammatical inaccuracy of beholds, where behold is evidently required. But the absence of any explanation of the phrase in Ambrose's notebook must render the whole question a matter of doubt and uncertainty. The tale told afterwards by David Williams, the shepherd on the mountain, must be taken for what it is worth. It is possibly an instance of the faculty of the marvelous, still surviving in an out-of-the-way district. Or, and this is more likely, it is a distorted account of a perfectly natural incident. It must be noted, however, that Williams had a sort of faded reputation as a seer among the inhabitants of the lonely mountain farms, or, in the words of a gentleman connected with the Psychical Research Society, he was highly susceptible to the influence of impressions of a hallucinatory character. It should be premised that the man in question had seen Ambrose and Sylvia walking together once or twice soon after their arrival at Montes. Ambrose, he said, talked to him for some time on one occasion, and in confirmation of this, it may be mentioned that there is a brief sentence in the notebook about a strange-looking old shepherd with visionary blue-gray eyes. I spoke to him, but he seemed stupid enough. His hands were gnarled and twisted, with rheumatism or gout, I suppose, and looked like the knotted roots of a tree. Williams then asserts that on a certain Sunday morning he was keeping a sharp lookout after the sheep under his charge. Several of the flock had been missed during the summer, and David Williams had made up his mind that they had been stolen, and that the thief was a man named Lewis, a collier from Pont Nouweneth, near Pontepal. Williams had seen, or thought he had seen, Lois, as he called them, prowling about the mountain in a suspicious manner more than once, and he hinted, being well enough pleased with his occult reputation, that he had seen Lois with the sheep over his shoulder in a pewter dish, which served for a magic crystal in his cottage. An interesting case of autosuggested hallucination, according to the psychical researcher. However, having come to the conclusion that Sunday would be a likely day for the felonious collier's operations, he went into hiding in a brake not far from Montes. Well concealed by the thick undergrowth of hazel and maple, he was able to sweep the mountainside above him, and he could see the track by which the sheep-stealer would probably approach. It was a bright and sunny morning. The sky was deep blue, and here and there little delicate clouds, fleecy white, floated across it. The breeze blew up from the sea, and tossing woods lightened and darkened before it. One could see the waves of the wind as if it were reflected in the cornfields. And the hills and valleys of Gwent, its rivers and streams, its hanging woods, its white farm walls, were all glittering in the happy peace of the pure sunlight. In his hiding place among the hazel boughs, the shepherd said that the sound of all the bells of all the world came upon him. St. Michael by Torvine, St. Frechva on the hill were chiming. He heard St. Cadoc ringing in Caramain, and there were faint individual notes of single bells from little churches by the Soar. The bells made, he said, music and melody to charm the heart. He kept his eyes intently fixed on the wall of mountain that rose up above him. He could see his sheep feeding by twos and threes in the islands of turf among the tall bracken. It would not be difficult for a man to hide deep in the fern, and wait till a sheep grazed within reach, and then to catch hold of the nearest leg and draw the prey into shelter. The wind tossed the bracken to and fro. A brief struggle would not be noticeable, and the thief might crawl off under shelter for a considerable distance. Williams tried to keep one eye on the flock and the other on the path from the north, whence he thought Lois would approach, unless he were already safely hidden under the shaking green fronds, just waiting for his opportunity. A little to the left of his line of vision, on the verge between a broken field and the wild mountainside, there was a well shaded by a great thorn tree, which the old people used to call St. Tylo's Well. The water was supposed to be good for the cure of certain sicknesses. It was not more than 100 yards from Craddock's farm, Hentis. Williams could not quite say what first attracted his attention to the well. He had a feeling, as he said, that a bright light was shining there, as if the sun were glittering on glass. He did not want to look. He was afraid that his attention might be distracted at the crucial moment. There were several sheep grazing quite close to the wall of fern, but he could not keep his eyes fixed. There was all the time that sensation as of a fountain of white light rising from the well. So at last he turned his head, that he might be satisfied that there was nothing to look at. Then, he said, something seemed to shoot all over him. His sensations, as he described them, were similar to those of an electric shock, and he saw a figure standing by the well under the thorn tree. Later on, when he told the story a good many times and had been questioned about it, he indulged in an elaborate and detailed account of this figure, the details being, evidently, more or less picturesque afterthoughts. But in his first tale, he confessed that he could not say anything very particular about this shape by the well. He would not, for instance, undertake to swear that it was a man, though he thought it was a man, but not somehow dressed as a man is dressed, not nowadays, whatever. The light, if there had been any light at all, had vanished. There was only someone there, and William said that sheep or no sheep, he felt he must go and see who it was. He did not know why, but so it was with him. So he came out of the thicket and began to run towards the well as fast as he could. And then, as his luck would have it, his foot was caught, and he fell full length. It was a minute, perhaps, before he could get up and free himself from the entanglement of the brambles, and it may be that he was a little dazed by the shock of the fall. But to his amazement, the figure that he had seen was no longer by the well under the thorn. Instead, the two young people staying at Hentis were walking towards him. They smiled and nodded as they passed him, standing all astonished and confused, like a man roused suddenly from some strange and bewildering dream. This, and nothing more, was the story told by David Williams before he had introduced the element of imagination. It is not worth while detailing the later elaborations of the shepherd's fancy. It is probable, for instance, that his description of what happened when he looked round and saw the figure is but an amplification of the first simple statement as to the shock or shudder that passed through him. As has been said, the original story may be due to the faculty of the marvelous, or it may be a confused account of an ordinary incident. But there seems no reason to suppose that in this early version the shepherd did not at least intend to be veridical, and one or two circumstances in his tale, it is needless to specify them, will not be without interest to responsible and proficient students. It should be said that Ambrose, who of course heard of the story, declined to comment upon it in any sense whatever, and his manner made it impossible to press the question. His notebook contains no reference of any sort to the shepherd's statement. After his brief description of this second visit to the cup of Tylo Sant, some half-dozen pages are scattered over with odd words and phrases and incomplete tales which no doubt had their meaning and suggestion for the writer, but would be unintelligible to those who do not possess the key. For example, Arian-Hreget made a great feast on the day of Pentecost. It was of such splendor and richness, being constituted with all the most delicate meats of the earth, and the best wines of Greece and Gascony, and the entire world, being also graced with the art of song, and the presence of the most famous minstrels of the island of Britain, that it was known as the illustrious entertainment of Arian-Hreget. Arian sat on high on a platform thickly strewn with green rushes. His robe was of satin of the color of a red flame. He sat on a cushion of green satin. At the end of the banquet, Morgan the butler served a most precious and aromatic wine from some unknown region of the earth that was called wine of Pentecost. All who drank it praised its color, its flavor, and its odor, and were filled with a great joy. Then there came in a sorry little fellow, and craved speech with Arian. Forthwith it was granted, and he spoke. "King Arian," said he, "this entertainment is imperfect." "Tell me in what respect," said the king, thinking that the man was a jester. "With all my heart," said he, "it is because you have had no fit drink. And there can be no good feast without good drink, and you have not tasted the only drink that has been provided by the natural world." With that he drew from under his ragged cloak an old wooden bowl, which he had dipped in the stream as he came on his way to court. In the bowl there was some good water. There were also pebbles, some mud, a few weeds, a snail, and other impurities. "This," he said, "is the only true drink in the world, for who saw a beast that drank wine? Wine is, in fact, the liquor of dreamers and madmen." Arian and his guests laughed so heartily that the earth shook beneath the hall, and this speech concerning the wine and water is known as one of the 3 unreasonable sayings of the island of Britain. Again, Taliesin said that a song was still a song, even though the poet had never inscribed it in any characters, and it was declared that the inspiration in the soul of the bard was of greater reality than the trees of the wood, ovium characters. A bard uttered this sentence: "There is dark earth, there is a seed, there is germination, there is a root, there is a stem with leaves, there is a flower with concealed juices, there comes a bee, there is a golden honey, there is distilled mead in foaming horns, there is inspiration and unction in the spirit of the bard." This sentence was confirmed, and it was added that more than once inspiration had been given to poets who were fasting from meat and drink, and thus splendid and magnificent odes had been produced. The remaining notes and jottings are even more fragmentary and inconclusive, and it seems most likely that Ambrose used these remaining leaves as a kind of commonplace book. They may not refer in any way to his life at the Wern or to his relations with Sylvia Vaughan. It is certain that she was very dear to him, dearest of all indeed, and yet it was remarked that when, some 5 years later, she died very suddenly, she was apparently in perfect health, but was found one morning dead in her bed, he showed no signs of grief or even of shock. Indeed, if it had not been an impossible supposition, those who saw him soon after the news of Sylvia's death would have been inclined to think that he was endeavoring to suppress the signs of a joy and a delight that were almost unendurable in the intensity of their rapture. Strangely enough, certain papers of his seem almost to confirm this supposition, extravagant as it appears to be. They most certainly show no evidence of grief, nor even a passing depression. One sentence from these papers must be quoted here, by reason of the bearing it may have on the matters which have been just recorded. It is taken from a diary kept by Ambrose some 3 months after Sylvia's death. He was at the Wern, endeavoring to comfort her poor father, who was in the bitterest grief. In this diary, then, he writes under a certain date: "We wandered by the old paths, by the places of the old altars, by the well of the fishermen, by the hidden shrines, by the holy streams, by the valleys, and by hills now doubly hallowed by miracles which are past all utterance. We understood as never before the miracles of the secrets of the saints, of the secret glory which is hidden from the holy angels." It is difficult to believe that Mr. Vaughan is referred to in this passage. It would be more difficult still for anyone who had known Ambrose Merrick to believe him guilty of any species of occult quackery or mystification.